So now you're in the planning process of your vacation, and obviously there's going to be a lot of transportation options that are going to be available to you. You're going to use an airplane to get to your destination. You're also going to be using things like taxis or public transportation, and you might also be using trains. But for first-time travelers, there can be some problems that you can run into, and if you're not aware of them, they can put a huge hamper on your trip. So that's what we're going to talk about inside of this video today. We're going to talk about some of the different modes of transportation and some of the different problems that you could run into. So that's what this video is going to be about. So anyways, let's go. The first thing I want to talk about inside of this video is traveling on trains. Now, trains are a great way to get around from destination to destination. They're very reliable and they're also very economical. However, if you are spending a lot of time on trains, it can also eat into your trip. It can use up a lot of extra time that you could use for other things. So this is the first big thing that you need to consider whenever you're planning out your itinerary. So let's say, for example, you are a traveler that only has 7 days to dedicate to your trip. And maybe you're going into it thinking that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that you may never get again. With travelers like this, they're often going to try to see as much as they possibly can. Maybe you want to go to Rome and you want to see the Colosseum and the Roman Forum. You also want to see St. Peter's Basilica while you're there. Maybe you want to take a trip up to Florence, get out into the Tuscany countryside, see the Ponte Vecchio, see things like the Uffizi and the Da Vinci Museum. Maybe you want to go up to Pisa and see the Leaning Tower of Pisa or Bologna. If you're trying to go to all of these destinations, though, within a very short itinerary, you're going to end up spending a lot of your trip on trains. When a lot of first-time travelers are planning out their train trips, they often only think about the time it takes to get from destination to destination. However, there's also a lot of other things that you have to consider when it comes to train travel, especially with how much time you are actually using. So for example, first thing in the morning, you're going to have to find some sort of transportation to the station, whether that be a taxi or a public transportation. You're probably going to want to get to the train station at least 30 minutes early so that you can figure out what platform it's on and also what time your train arrives. Then once you get to your new location, you're again going to have to find transportation to the hotel. You're going to have to go through the check-in process, drop off your luggage, and then of course you may end up having to find transportation to whatever event it was that you were first going to in that location. So these are just a few extra things to think about because a 2-hour train ride could easily turn into 4 or 5 hours. Now, if you're taking a 14-day trip and you're only getting on trains just 2 or 3 times, obviously in the grand scheme of your vacation, that's not a lot of extra time. But if you're only working with a 7-day itinerary, this is something that you have to consider. If you are going to 5 different locations within that 7 days and you're losing 4 or 5 hours every single time you travel, you could end up losing an entire day or more off of your trip. Now, obviously, a lot of this is just personal preference, and it's going to be based on what you actually want to achieve inside of your trip. Maybe you're one of those people that really like trains and you want to see a lot of the countryside that's in between a lot of the major cities. Or maybe you just want to spend a little bit more extra alone time with your family. And if this is the case, then you're probably not going to mind that extra time being spent. However, if you are one of those people that really wants to get into the art museums and you really want to go and see all of these different sites, it is stuff that you have to consider because the more time you spend on those trains, the less time that you're going to get inside of your trip to actually do those other things. Another important thing to consider when it comes to train travel is that delays can and will happen. Now, in most circumstances, it may only be a few minutes. Most of the trains inside of Europe run very well, and usually they're very reliable. However, from time to time, you could also encounter a strike. And if you are unfortunate enough to run into one of these, it could put a huge delay in your plans. Now, most of these strikes are usually resolved within a day or so. However, you have to to consider the time it would take you to rebook your train tickets and also get to your destination. If you had something major that you wanted to see on your trip in that new location, you could end up missing out on it. So again, this is just something you have to kind of consider whenever you're planning trains out inside of your itinerary. The second important thing to consider when it comes to transportation inside of your itinerary is, of course, air travel. Now, as someone who travels quite a bit, I can tell you that the airlines have really struggled here over the past few years. Obviously, there are multiple factors that sort of play into this. But just like trains, delays can and will happen, and you need to be planning for them inside of your itinerary, or else it could end up putting a huge dent in your vacation. To give you guys a personal example, the very first time that me and my wife flew to Rome, we actually got delayed by about 7 hours inside of our home airport. There was some sort of technical issue on the plane. I mean, thankfully, they didn't allow us to get onto it. But because of this, by the time we got to Washington, D.C., we ended up missing our connecting flight to Rome. This meant that we had to go rent a hotel room and stay overnight, get back up and get to the airport by the next morning. And because of all of this, we actually missed the entire first day off of our trip. When it comes to air travel, it's really not a question of if, but when. And there are a lot of different factors that could play into this. I mean, obviously, in our case, it was a technical issue, but let's say there was a pop-up lightning storm. I mean, things like this can and will happen. And when they do, it often means that your plane is going to be delayed. Now, obviously, you don't always have control over these things. You have no control over whether or not a pop-up storm is going to happen, but you do have control over your itinerary. Let's say, for example, in our case where we missed the entire first day, we had made some reservations at a restaurant. Now, a lot of these restaurants where you make reservations are going to have very strict policies against cancellations. Some of them will be 24 hours. Some of them might be 48 or 72. Obviously, if it's 24 hours and we're on and off planes all day and trying to travel and deal with, whatever's going on at the airports, we're probably not going to have time to call and cancel. And that would mean that if we had had reservations on day one, we would have lost out on that money. But not only that, let's say that we had planned to go to the Colosseum. If we didn't make it there on that day, then we're missing out on a huge part of our trip. Not only should you be thinking about the first day of your trip, but you really also need to be thinking about the first half of that second day as well. Let's say, for example, that we had plans to go to Florence. We were going to get on a train at 9 a.m. on day 2. However, our plane does not arrive until 8 a.m. That gives us exactly an hour to get through customs and then, of course, find transportation into the city. Now, customs, it sometimes can take a little bit longer, sometimes shorter. You really have no way of planning out for that. Also, once you get done, you're going to have to get some transportation, whether it's calling a taxi or buying a ticket to get onto a train. You're going to have to wait on that train. And then, of course, it's a 30-minute ride into the city. If everything does not go to plan, you're probably going to miss that 9 a.m. train ticket out of Rome. You're going to have to rebook your tickets. Then you're going to have to wait for the next train. So you can see how all of this stuff kind of snowballs a little bit. And it could end up being that you don't get to Florence until 2 or 3 hours later. So this is definitely something you need to think about. Not only should you consider what you're doing on day one, but if you miss day one for some reason, what you are doing the first half of day 2 as well. Now, some of you guys might be asking, well, what are some of the ways that I can use to avoid some of these problems? And one of the suggestions I've kind of already given you guys, and that's to be aware of that very first day. Normally, when I'm planning out my itinerary, I will leave that day completely open. That way, if for some reason we miss it, we don't miss out on a whole lot of our trip. If we do make it on that day, then we can use it for a lot of different things. There are tours that you can actually walk up and buy the tickets for on that day. There's also a lot of sites like the Trevi Fountain or the Pantheon or even the Spanish Steps where you don't necessarily have to make any sort of reservations in advance. And these are the types of things that I will normally do on day one. Sometimes we will also use that time just to explore the area around our hotel to get familiar with our surroundings, find out where the closest pharmacies are or the closest supermarkets, and just get a lay of the land. And for some reason, though, if you don't make it on that day, then you really haven't missed out on that much. So that's the first big suggestion that I would give, is just to make sure that that very first day and the very last day as well are sort of left open so that you're not missing out on something. The second big piece of advice that I usually give to a lot of people is to think of your trip in half of day increments. Now, with the earlier example where we flew in on day 2, we got there at 8 o'clock, then we had to get on a train to Florence at 9. When I came up with that scenario, I was actually thinking of my trip in half day increments. What was I doing on the first half of that second day? And this will just help you to organize your trip a little bit better. To add to that, not only do I think of my days in half day increments, but when I'm trying to figure out what all I want to see, I also plan them by location. So, for example, if I had one full day to spend in Rome, more than likely the way I would spend it is the first half of the day, I would go to the Colosseum and the Roman Forum. I would give myself a cushion in the middle of the day so that I could sit down and have a really nice lunch. And then for the second half, I would probably see the Victor Emmanuel Monument and the Capitoli Museum. And because all of these are located right there together, it's going to help me to maximize what I'm doing that day. I'm not going to have to get in taxis and travel halfway across the city. So this is another very key point. Not only do you want to plan your days out in half day increments, but as you're trying to figure out what you want to do on those days, you really want to make sure that you're thinking about the location of each one of those sites. The third big piece of advice that I always give travelers when they're planning out their itinerary is really take some time to think about how many locations you are going to based on the amount of days that you have to dedicate to your trip. Now, I can tell you from personal experience, spending time inside of Rome because it's such a massive city, there is no way to see everything that I wanted to see within 3 days. You really need 4 or 5 good days to really experience some of these bigger cities. And if you're trying to go to too many locations in a 7-day period, there's going to be a lot that you miss out on. So again, this is all personal preference. There may be some people that only have 1 or 2 specific things that they want to see in Rome. If that's the case, then by all means, make sure that you figure that into your itinerary. But for a lot of people, it's going to feel very rushed if you're trying to go to too many places in a very short period of time. Give yourself a little bit of extra time in each location to really learn about the city and experience it in its entirety. The fourth big piece of advice that I always give to travelers is give yourself a little bit of extra time to just relax. A lot of times on these trips, you're going to want to try to see and do as much as you possibly can. And at the end of the trip, you're probably going to feel very worn out. One of the big things about traveling to Europe is just immersing yourself in the culture itself. This is a big part of the experience. Give yourself time to go stand at a bar and have a coffee with the locals, or sit down at a table somewhere with an Aperol Spritz. These are very important things that can really enhance the trip overall. Now, again, it's totally up to you. If you want to have that sort of trip where you're rushed all the time, and some people do, some people actually enjoy that, then by all means still do that. But giving yourself that little bit of extra time to immerse yourself in the culture is going to really enhance that trip and make it that much more special. The fifth and final point that I'm going to make is don't be fooled by simply looking at a map when you are trying to figure out the different sites that you want to go to. Let's say, for example, you want to go to the Spanish Steps, then you want to walk over to, somewhere over next to the train station. On a map, it may look like a very short walk when in reality, it could take you 35 to 45 minutes. Some of these locations can take a lot more time to get to than you might actually think because it's a little bit deceiving by looking at them on a map. This also pertains to the transportation as well. If you have to take a taxi, obviously you have to wait for that taxi to get to your location. Then you have to drive all the way across town, and that can be challenging depending on what time of day it is and how much traffic there is. So again, these are just all little things that you really need to think about when you're planning out your itinerary, because a simple 5-minute walk or a 5-minute cab ride could really end up turning into a lot more time than you actually think. Now, as I always try to mention inside of all of my videos, obviously traveling is a personal preference. Some people are going to choose to travel different from others. So the reason for this information is not really to persuade you or to say that this is the way you should do things, but just really to give you guys some things to think about. Obviously, there are a lot of challenges when it comes to transportation between different destinations. And if you aren't aware of these things and maybe you have a very small itinerary to deal with, you could see how it can cause some problems. So again, I just wanted to share this information with you so that you can make the best decision for yourself. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching this. I really appreciate it. If you would, please leave likes or comments down below and make sure and hit that subscribe button because it really helps this channel out a lot. Anyways, thank you guys so much and we'll see you in the next video.